Some designs are timeless, like the steel helmet that shielded 1,000 foreheads and the Colt 45 pistol that stopped 1,000 charging feet. At first glance, it was an unlikely hero of the Second World War. A blocky, heavy sidearm designed back in 1911, carried on the hips of Marines and soldiers who trudged through mud, sweat, and salt air. It looked almost primitive compared to the sleek rifles that dominated the battlefield. To many eyes, especially those of Japanese troops, it seemed more relic than threat. They laughed at it, dismissing the weapon as an outdated American toy, a trinket of a bygone war. In the heat of the Pacific, where bayonets gleamed and bamboo thickets swallowed men whole, the pistol appeared little more than a cumbersome ornament hanging from a soldier's belt. But laughter has a way of souring when the first shot cuts through it. The Pacific theater was no place for illusions. For the Americans, though, the pistol carried a different meaning. It was not an ornament, but a safeguard, a final promise that in the chaos of a charge or the darkness of a foxhole, a soldier would not stand empty-handed. Weapons carried reputations, and reputations could comfort or erode a man's nerve. But reputations shift with experience. The Pacific theater was no place for illusions. Jungle humidity clung to every surface. Rifles swelled with moisture and boots rotted before their soles wore down. Men fought not only an enemy, but the land itself, with mosquitoes biting as relentlessly as bullets. Amid this brutal environment, the Japanese came with confidence rooted in discipline and tradition. Their Arisaka rifles, long and sturdy, gave them reach in open combat. Their bayonets, sometimes longer than the rifles of their opponents, symbolized ferocity, a belief that spirit and steel would always overwhelm. To them, the Colt 45 seemed like an afterthought, a weapon for men too weak to face a charge with cold steel. Soldiers scoffed, calling Americans over-reliant on machines. They imagined that when the battle closed, when rifles jammed or grenades ran out, the Americans would stand exposed with only a pistol between them and death. Yet the Colt was no ordinary sidearm. Each round it carried was heavier, larger, more punishing than the slim cartridges of Europe's pistols. When it fired, it spoke with a guttural force, a sharp crack that echoed differently through jungle trees. But the Japanese did not hear that voice at first. They saw only its bulk, laughed at the weight that sagged American belts, and muttered among themselves that no civilized army would cling to such a clunky device. At Guadalcanal in 1942, where the first great collision of U.S. and Japanese ground forces erupted, that laughter reached its cruelest edge. Japanese patrols mocked the very sight of Marines oiling their sidearms. They told each other that American pistols would fail in the muck, that they were better suited to saloon shootouts than tropical war. And the Marines, weary and half-starved, heard those rumors carried by prisoners or through broken scraps of translation. Some grinned bitterly, letting the enemy believe what they wished. Others worried quietly that perhaps their pistol really was too old, too heavy, too clumsy for the fight ahead. Weapons carried reputations, and reputations could comfort or erode a man's nerve. But reputations shift with experience. One evening, as shadows stretched long across the palms and the sound of crickets drowned the gunfire for a rare moment, a young Marine named Robert Sullivan sat cleaning his Colt. His fingers moved with the calm instinct of ritual. Slide back, chamber checked, barrel wiped clean. Around him, older men smoked in silence. One leaned in, muttering they laugh now. Let them. They'll learn soon enough. Sullivan looked down at the weapon. It wasn't pretty. Its finish was dulled by salt air, its grip worn from countless hands. But in its weight, he felt something steady, something immovable, as though the pistol itself refused to bend to doubt. The baptism of fire came in the dripping jungles of Guadalcanal, where the laughter that once echoed from enemy lines dissolved into the raw roar of battle. The Marines who had been mocked for their heavy pistols now clutched them in fists slick with sweat, their ears filled with the deafening symphony of insects, gunfire, and the guttural cries of men charging through the trees. It was August 1942, and the Japanese, determined to sweep the Americans back into the sea, sent wave after wave of infantry across the tangled ground. Their doctrine prized shock and speed, bayonets fixed, voices raised in furious banzai shouts, meant to unnerve before they struck. But in the undergrowth, where shadows swallowed distance and rifles snagged on branches, combat was not fought at 50 yards. It was fought at 5. Robert Sullivan, the young Marine who had once doubted the value of his sidearm, crouched low in his foxhole as the night trembled with sound. His Springfield rifle lay beside him, its barrel already steaming from repeated volleys. The bolt felt stiff, and his shoulder burned from the recoil of too many rounds fired in haste. Around him, the line was straining, men firing wildly at shapes darting between trees. He heard a comrade curse as a jammed rifle clicked uselessly, the sound swallowed instantly by the chaos. Sullivan reached instinctively for the Colt at his hip. The weight he had once resented now steadied him. When the charge broke against their position, it was not the long rifles that saved them. Figures burst from the darkness, bayonets flashing, feet pounding the soft earth. Sullivan fired his pistol, the muzzle flash searing his night vision. The .45 slug struck the lead attacker squarely, the body collapsing mid-stride with a thud that jarred the ground. Another came, blade raised, and again Sullivan fired once, twice. The recoil was sharp, but the effect immediate. The man crumpled before his momentum carried him forward. In those breathless seconds, Sullivan learned what no lecture could teach. The Colt did not require respect to prove itself. It demanded it. The Japanese had laughed because they believed their rifles gave them range, their bayonets courage. But the Pacific was not France in 1918. The jungle pressed men close, turning firefights into knife fights, converting riflemen into brawlers. Pistols, once dismissed as secondary, became primary tools of survival. Marines clearing dugouts, stumbling through vines, or wrestling in the mud found that the Colt's heavy bark ended a struggle in a heartbeat. Its rounds were few, 7 in a magazine. But each was a promise, final and absolute. Reports filtered back from these clashes, small stories carried by weary voices. A lieutenant whose pistol saved a machine gun nest when Japanese infantry broke through. A radio operator who fended off a sudden bayonet rush with his sidearm alone. Sullivan himself, whose hands shook not from fear, but from the strange, awful realization that he was alive because his pistol had spoken first. These accounts stitched together a reputation no propaganda could erase. The pistol that had been mocked as outdated now earned whispers of awe, and yet unmixed with unease. Soldiers knew the Colt was no gentle companion. Its recoil bruised palms, its report deafened ears in enclosed spaces, and its weight dragged constantly at the belt. Some cursed it under their breath, but never with conviction. A Marine might complain, but he also checked his magazine twice before nightfall, his fingers brushing the cold steel like a talisman. In foxholes, men swapped stories of the Colt's power, exaggerating for humor, but rooted in truth. "She'll knock a man clean out of his shoes," one swore. And though laughter followed, no one doubted the essence of the claim. The Japanese began to notice as well. Prisoners taken during the campaign muttered uneasily about the American sidearm. In captured diaries, officers described comrades felled instantly by single pistol shots. Their disbelief showed in the words, astonishment that a weapon so small could halt a charge so completely. For a culture that revered the bayonet and the sword as extensions of the warrior's spirit, the Colt represented something alien, something brute and undeniable. It was not noble steel. It was mechanical certainty. The war did not pause after Guadalcanal. Victory on one island only opened the gates to another, and the Marines carried their scars forward like permanent ink. The Colt 45, once mocked, now traveled as a proven companion. On transport ships bound for Tarawa, Saipan, and Polilliu, men adjusted their holsters with a familiarity that bordered on ritual. The pistol was no longer a backup in their minds, but an extension of survival. Robert Sullivan, no longer the hesitant boy who had doubted his sidearm, now checked his magazines with a soldier's superstition, as if ensuring that each round was a promise he might have to cash in. The Pacific Campaign had become an island-to-island crucible, and the Colt's voice would echo in each furnace. Tarawa in November 1943 showed how cruelly close combat could become. The atoll was barely 2 miles long, a speck of coral crusted with Japanese fortifications. Marines waded ashore through waist-deep water, burdened by packs and fire, while machine guns raked the surf. Many never made it to the sand. Those who did found themselves crawling into bunkers so tight that rifles became burdens. Grenades went in first, and when smoke cleared, pistols led the way. Sullivan watched as a corporal beside him drew his Colt, its black frame gleaming in the sun, and fired into a dugout where shadows stirred. The roar was deafening in the confined space. When silence returned, the corporal muttered without looking up, "The rifles for the beach, the pistols for the war." It was not bravado, only recognition. By Saipan in June 1944, that recognition had hardened into doctrine. The Japanese fought not only above ground, but below, in caves that honeycombed the volcanic hills. Rifles were too long to maneuver. Bayonets were useless in the dark. Marines crawled in pairs, one with a flashlight trembling in his grip, the other with a pistol raised and ready. Sullivan carried his Colt into one such cavern, the air thick with the scent of sulfur and sweat. He fired at shapes barely seen, muzzle flashes painting the rock walls in bursts of orange. Each shot was not just defense, but necessity, a moment's margin between life and the unseen blade of an enemy inches away. The Japanese had stopped laughing. Capture journals spoke of the heavy American pistol with words of awe and bitterness. "It kills with one strike," one officer had written, his script shaky but clear. They had come to understand what Sullivan and his comrades already knew. In the close, choking corners of island war, size mattered, and the .45 delivered something final that no smaller round could imitate. The same men who once sneered at the weapon now feared its authority. Yet authority came at a cost. At Peleliu, September 1944, where the coral ridges turned red under the sun, Sullivan saw firsthand how the pistol exacted its toll on the mind. He had used his sidearm 3 times in one day, each at a distance where he could see the whites of another man's eyes. The memory clung to him like the sticky heat. He wiped the pistol clean that night with slow, deliberate care, his face hollow. To trust the weapon was also to accept what it required. The Colt was reliable, unflinching, but did not leave room for illusions. Each round was a full stop, not a question mark. The men spoke of it differently now. There was less humor, fewer exaggerated boasts. They carried it with quiet respect, not unlike the way a priest might carry a relic. Machine gunners swore by it. Officers carried it like a badge, and riflemen envied those who had been issued one. In mess tents, the story circled. How a pistol had saved a foxhole. How a lone sergeant held off a charge with 7 rounds. How in the black mouth of a cave, the Colt's voice was the last word. The weapon had ceased to be just a tool. It had become part of the mythology of the campaign. Proof that survival could hinge on something once considered trivial. Sullivan noticed the shift most when replacements arrived. Fresh-faced boys straight from training eyed the pistols with doubt, just as he once had. The veterans said little. They simply handed them spare magazines and let the islands teach their lessons. Those lessons came quickly on Saipan. A replacement froze when his rifle jammed, only to be yanked aside by Sullivan, who emptied his Colt into the charging enemy. The boy's wide-eyed silence afterward was enough. Words were unnecessary. The Japanese, desperate and driven, responded with fury. Their banzai charges grew more reckless, their night assaults more frantic. They still carried their bayonets with pride. But the certainty behind their laughter was gone. For once they had scoffed, now they braced. They had seen too many comrades fall mid-stride, cut short by a weapon they had dismissed. Irony clung to the war like smoke. The sidearm they had called a toy had become their nightmare in the dark. By Iwo Jima in February 1945, the Colt was legend. The black sands and volcanic tunnels magnified its reputation. Sullivan descended into caves with his pistol drawn, every step echoing against stone. The muzzle flashes carved brief, violent murals on the walls. Men silhouetted, dust swirling, eyes burning. When he emerged back into daylight, his ears ringing, he carried with him the certainty that the pistol had been designed for this exact war, as though fate had anticipated the struggle decades earlier. Still, the pistol could not carry the whole burden. Its magazine was small, its weight constant. Soldiers joked grimly that the Colt will save you, but only 7 times. That was a razor's edge they walked, confidence tempered by limitation. Yet even those 7 chances meant everything. Sullivan often thought of the men who had laughed at the pistol years earlier. Did they know in their final moments how wrong they had been? Did they understand the cost of underestimating steel, shaped by experience rather than tradition? The turning point had been reached. The Colt was no longer mocked, no longer doubted. It was feared, respected, woven into the rhythm of island war as surely as the roar of artillery or the whisper of waves against the shore. For Sullivan, it was both shield and shadow, a reminder that survival came not only from courage, but from the cold precision of a weapon built to stop. The pistol had transformed from a joke into a verdict, its voice unanswerable in the close quarters of the Pacific. And yet, as the war ground forward, a question remained. If one pistol could alter the rhythm of battle, what would it mean when the final island came, when the struggle reached its crescendo? Sullivan, weary but unbroken, knew that the Colt would be there, too, speaking its blunt truth. But even he did not yet know how profoundly its voice would echo when the war neared its end. Some designs are timeless because they are born not of fashion but of necessity. By the war's end, the Colt 45 was no longer just a pistol. It was a companion, a symbol, and for many, the difference between silence and survival. The islands had burned that truth into the men who carried it. Robert Sullivan returned from the Pacific with the weight of its steel still pressed into his hip, though the holster was gone and the war behind him. In memory, however, it never left. When he spoke of the war years later, his words were rarely about strategy or generals. Instead, he spoke of the pistol that had ended the laughter, the weapon that had met a charge with finality and reshaped his idea of what it meant to endure. The legacy of the Colt was written in sweat, smoke, and silence. In Guadalcanal, Troa, Saipan, Polilliu, and Iwo Jima, men discovered that survival often meant fighting at distances where breath and fear mingled. Rifles, for all their range and power, faltered in caves and thicket. The Colt thrived in them. The pistol carried only 7 rounds in a magazine, yet each one struck with an authority that no opponent could dismiss. A man might stagger through wounds from smaller calibers, but a 45 round ended the argument. The Japanese, who had once laughed, recorded in diaries their astonishment. Some wrote bitterly of comrades falling instantly, as though felled by an unseen hand. Others admitted grudging respect, noting the weapon's terrible power. The pistol that had been a joke became a shadow, haunting their charges. The weapon's endurance stretched long after the war ended. It remained standard issue for the U.S. military until 1985, carried in Korea, Vietnam, and beyond. Even when replaced by newer designs, many units clung to it, unwilling to abandon the weight of its certainty. To hold a Colt 45 was to feel history in the palm.